Okay, so we know our ancestors of Africa were enslaved, but like what exactly happened in Africa that led up to the international shipping of slaves? Well, there's two main sides of the story that ultimately intertwine. When you speak of slavery in relation to Africans being transported via slave ship, you have to understand that there were slave trades that operated across oceans on both sides of the continent. Before the transatlantic slave trade was established, across the Sahara was the East African slave trade or Arab slave trade that operated across the Sahara Desert, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. Now, based upon my studies, I personally concluded that the reason for the East African slave trade is disguised within the repellence of religious dogma, but more so due to the exploitation of fallen African kingdoms for the purpose of controlling profitable trade markets.
Northeast Africa was a fallen land. It had been raped for 1,000 years. The conquest wasn't much of a conquest. Starting with the Cambyses invasion 550, and they didn't arrive until 639 AD. And the Cambyses invasion was 550 BC. Over 1,000 years later, they got there, and they had one invader after another, Greeks, Romans. What resistance was left? All the great structure torn down. They were ready for anything when they arrived. They said they're bringing a great civilization. They arrived to feast on the fallen body of a once great culture.
Historically speaking, the East African slave trade is described as a product of religious expeditions, when in reality its sole purpose was to expand populations via integration and exploit humans to fulfill a means of strengthening and profiting a foreign land through trade and labor. With the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, the Muslim Arabs began their Islamic conquest throughout the world, and by 711 they had occupied territory stretching from present-day Pakistan into Saudi Arabia, throughout North Africa into Spain, and this was recognized as the Umayyad Caliphate. In 633, the first four caliphates create what is called the Rashidun Caliphate and completes its takeover of the Arabian Peninsula, eliminating the Judaic and Christian nations within the region. As a result, this also shuts off the Empire Axum's access to trade within the Red Sea. The significance of the Axum Empire during this time period is what was once one of the most powerful African kingdoms of its time, accompanied with having a high volume of traffic through the trade markets of its land, has started to decline, which opened up the threshold to the Arabs' position amongst controlling the trade. And with the end of the Axumite presence within the Arabian Peninsula, the East African slave trade across the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea starts booming. During the Islamic conquest, they pretty much pillaged everybody they came across, except for the Nubians. And highlighted event of early conflict between the Islamic presence and the Nubians is the battles of Dongola in 642 and 652 with the Kingdom of Mercuria. Now, it is said that due to the Nubians' advanced archery skills that the Arabs ultimately deemed that this area wasn't worth the trouble. So what had happened was the Arabs were doing their Islamic conquest and they conquered Egypt and decided to venture further south and ran into the seceding kingdoms of what used to be the Kush Empire. The Arabs are getting their ass whooped and figured like this was a bit unnecessary. Fuck this land, and came up with the Bach Treaty, which was signed sometime in 652 and lasted around 600 and 700 years. Now, the stipulations of the Bach Treaty was that the Kingdom of Mercuria had to send the Arabs in Egypt slaves, lentils, and wheat, along with respecting each other's borders, and they were allowed to roam amongst each other's territories freely. Now, this peace treaty was specifically for the people of that kingdom, and it was negotiated to represent the Kingdom of Alodia as well, which was a neighboring kingdom in the Ethiopian region who used to have beef with Mercuria, but I guess they settled their differences by this time. And during the entire Islamic expedition, they are the only ones to get a peace treaty. Everybody else got ran down on. Hence, right next to Mercuria and Alodia was the remaining of the Axum Empire, which was abandoned after its decline and taken over by Arab herders. To understand what happened to Axum and what's happening to the rest of Africa, East Africa in particular, our Africans became an unwanted people boxed in by foreign invaders and rival kingdoms. So at this point in history, which is around the 7th and 8th century, any Africanite in the central southern region of Africa, or already a part of a strong kingdom, is either fleeing to avoid conflict, getting seized as a slave, or converting to Islam, if not killed during the process of all the above. The area that is highlighted to have produced the highest level of traffic during the East African slave trade is known as Zanzibar, which is an island off the Swahili coast. Before the arrival of Arabs, this land was recognized as Azania. It wasn't until the 8th century with the intermingling of Arabs that the Swahili identity was created. Upon invasion, the natives of Azania were quickly enslaved and dispersed amongst the many trade routes reaching as far as India and China, but the majority of the time the slaves were sent up the Red Sea towards the Middle East to work for various rulers amongst the land. Traditionally, Bantu people referred to as the Zanj would be captured off the coast of Southeast Africa and sent up the Red Sea to mine salt, harvest crops, and some were used as military subjects. In 869, the Zanj people revolt with the help of a fellow revolutionary by the name of Ali ibn Muhammad. This rebellion lasted until 883 and is recognized as the greatest African revolt during the Islamic migration period.
Every time you name an African revolutionary who used Islam as a rallying cry for revolutionary change against colonialism, it is the black side of Islam. Now, I can rattle off all these African revolutionists, and they nearly always became part of that same basic structure.
The Arab slave trade lasted clear until the 20th century, noting that Mecca was partially used as a slave market when Muslims would come for their Hajj. This lasted until 1962. Historians estimate during the East African slave trade between the 7th and 20th century, 10 to 20 million Africans were transported across the Sahara, Indian Ocean, and Red Sea, reaching its height around 1790 during the Sultans of Oman occupation of the trade routes.
The Omani Arabs, and El Mazaroi is an Omani Arab. The Omani Arabs established Zanzibar and made Zanzibar the largest slave trading force in the world.
And it could be way more than that, you feel what I'm saying? Because you got like Africans intermingling with Arabs. Nobody's making a real distinction in who's African and who's not, you feel what I'm saying? Because Arabs was enslaving other Arabs along with Africans enslaving other Africans. So like that 20 million, 10 million is a super estimate because they were just enslaving black people, and the people who was doing the enslaving knew who they was enslaving.
We travel along the edge of the Sahara to reach the Peuls, a pastoral people once numerous and powerful, now reduced to a few thousand by mass raids of slave merchants early in this century. They no longer have any cattle of their own. The great herds they lead to pasture are owned by Arab merchants, and the Peuls are so impoverished that they willingly offer themselves in slavery to the owners of these herds. But since they cannot all be taken, the young shepherds show their masters which are the strongest and most courageous among them by submitting to flagellation. The herd owners gaze impassively on the scene, enjoying vicariously the sadistic action before them, and knowing that the strongest will survive. Survivors smile and smile and pretend to ignore the pain. They fall on their knees and beg their Arab masters to accept their services. It still survives. In a small villa on the outskirts of an African city on the Red Sea, he gathers the children of his prostitutes in what is officially called an orphanage. Actually, it is a training school for slaves, rearing the children and training them until they are old enough to be of commercial interest to the traders of the Middle East. Prices vary according to age, color of skin, and the work the child is intended for. An attractive half-caste girl of 12 may be worth as much as $5,000. These little girls will eventually land either in a harem or in a brothel. If they look happy at the prospect before them, it is because their training under the Greek has led them to expect a life of wealth and ease and love. Several days later, we board a plane bound for Jeddah, a landing point for travelers to Mecca. We ask an officer on the plane the same question we had asked the captain of the ship. He simply hands us the passenger list. 20 persons on the flight are traveling together. Men, women, and children. 12 have round-trip tickets, and the other 8 one-way tickets. These 8 are in effect living traveler's checks that will be cashed in to pay the expenses of the return for the rest of the party.
They are women, servants, and children whom the 4 Arabs will sell as slaves. Their destiny as human travelers' checks has been decided years ago, and now they are carrying out that destiny.